In the affluent suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut, Margaret Chen works as a live-in housekeeper for the wealthy Whitmore family. When expensive items begin disappearing from the mansion, suspicion falls on the household staff. Richard Whitmore, a successful investment banker, decides to set a trap by strategically placing marked money around the house. What he discovers about Margaret's character will challenge everything he believed about trust, integrity, and the true measure of a person's worth. The November morning mist clung to the manicured lawns of Birchwood Lane like a gossamer veil, partially obscuring the grand colonial mansions that stood as monuments to American prosperity. Margaret Chen pulled her worn wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she walked through the ornate iron gates of the Whitmore estate, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp Connecticut air. At 42, she had been cleaning houses for nearly 15 years, but the Whitmore mansion still made her feel small every time she approached its imposing facade. The house loomed before her, its red brick exterior and white columns speaking of old money and established power. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the circular driveway, where Richard Whitmore's black Mercedes and his wife Victoria's white Range Rover sat like sleeping giants. Margaret had been working for the family for 3 years now, long enough to know their routines, their preferences, and their secrets, though she kept the latter to herself, with the discretion that had made her invaluable to wealthy employers throughout Fairfield County. "Morning, Margaret," called James, the groundskeeper, as he raked the last of the autumn leaves from the front walkway. His weathered face showed genuine warmth, a rarity among the staff who often competed for the family's favor. "Good morning, James. Looks like winter's coming early this year," Margaret replied, her slight accent betraying her origins in rural China, though she had lived in America for over 2 decades. Inside the mansion's marble foyer, the grandfather clock chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through rooms filled with priceless antiques and original artwork. Margaret hung her coat in the staff closet and tied her graying hair back into its usual neat bun. She had learned long ago that invisibility was her greatest asset in this world, to clean, organize, and maintain without drawing attention to herself. The kitchen, her first stop each morning, was a monument to modern luxury. Granite countertops stretched beneath custom cabinets, while professional-grade appliances gleamed under warm pendant lighting. Margaret began her ritual of preparing the family's breakfast, her movements efficient and practiced. Mrs. Whitmore preferred her coffee with oat milk and a touch of cinnamon, while Mr. Whitmore took his black with exactly 2 sugar cubes. Never granulated sugar, always cubes. "You're early today," came a voice from the doorway. Margaret turned to see Diane, the family's personal assistant, entering with her usual air of self-importance. Diane was younger, blonde, and college-educated, everything Margaret was not. Their relationship existed in a delicate balance of professional courtesy and underlying tension. "The bus was running ahead of schedule," Margaret replied simply, not mentioning that she had actually walked the last mile to save the fare. Every dollar counted when you were supporting your elderly mother's medical bills and your daughter's college tuition. "Well, there's going to be a change in routine today," Diane announced, pulling out her phone to check her messages. "Mr. Whitmore wants to speak with all the household staff at 9 o'clock. Something about security measures." Margaret's stomach tightened. In her experience, meetings about security usually meant someone was in trouble. She continued preparing breakfast, but her mind raced through recent events. Had she forgotten to lock a door, broken something valuable? Her hands moved automatically through familiar tasks, while anxiety built in her chest. The morning passed in a blur of routine activities. Margaret served breakfast to the family in the formal dining room, where oil paintings of Whitmore ancestors gazed down from the walls with stern expressions. Richard Whitmore, a tall man in his early 50s with silver temples and an air of quiet authority, barely acknowledged her presence as she refilled his coffee cup. His wife Victoria, perfectly styled even at 8 in the morning, offered her usual polite but distant smile. Their teenage daughter Emma was the only family member who ever truly saw Margaret as a person. "Thanks, Margaret." "Did you see they're predicting snow this weekend?" Emma asked, looking up from her phone. "Yes, miss, I made sure to bring in the outdoor cushions yesterday," Margaret replied warmly. Emma was away at boarding school most of the year, but during her visits home, she always treated the staff with genuine kindness, a trait that seemed to skip generations in wealthy families. As 9 o'clock approached, Margaret found herself in the living room alongside the other household staff: James, the groundskeeper; Diane, the personal assistant; Carlos, the part-time driver; and Mrs. Henderson, the elderly cook, who had worked for the family for over a decade. The room, with its Persian rugs and leather furniture, felt more like a courtroom than a living space. Richard Whitmore entered with the measured pace of a man accustomed to commanding attention. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his silver watch catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. He positioned himself near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his expression grave. "I've called you all here because we have a serious problem," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of high-stakes financial negotiations. "Over the past month, several valuable items have gone missing from the house. My wife's diamond earrings from her jewelry box, cash from my desk drawer, and yesterday, a rare first-edition book from my study." The silence in the room was suffocating. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, though she had nothing to hide. She glanced at the other staff members, noting the mixture of shock, indignation, and fear on their faces. Mrs. Henderson's weathered hands shook slightly as she gripped her apron. "I want to be clear," Whitmore continued, his steel-gray eyes scanning each face. "I'm not making accusations, but the reality is that these thefts coincide with our current household staff. I've spoken with our security company, and we'll be installing additional cameras throughout the house." Margaret swallowed hard. The implication was clear. They were all suspects. In her 3 years of faithful service, she had never taken so much as a leftover sandwich without permission. The accusation, however indirect, felt like a physical blow. "I understand this is uncomfortable," Whitmore said, though his tone suggested little actual empathy. "But I need to protect my family and our belongings. If anyone has information about these incidents, I encourage you to speak up now." The room remained silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Margaret wanted to protest her innocence, to remind him of her years of loyal service, but she knew better. In her world, silence was often the safest response. The tension in the Whitmore household thickened over the following days, like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. Margaret noticed the subtle changes immediately, how conversations stopped when she entered a room, how Victoria Whitmore's eyes followed her movements with newfound scrutiny, and how even Emma seemed more distant during her brief interactions with the staff. Margaret threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, hoping that perfect performance might shield her from suspicion. She polished silver until it gleamed like mirrors, organized closets with military precision, and ensured every surface in the mansion sparkled. Yet the weight of being watched pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible burden. It was a gray Wednesday afternoon when Richard Whitmore made his decision. He sat in his mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by leather-bound books and framed degrees from Harvard Business School, his fingers drumming against his desk as he contemplated his next move. The missing items had escalated. Victoria's pearl necklace had vanished from her dressing room just the night before, and his growing frustration demanded action. He pulled out his phone and dialed his old college roommate, Detective Michael Torres of the Greenwich Police Department. "Mike, it's Richard. I need some advice about this theft situation at the house." "Still having problems?" Torres asked, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who dealt with the wealthy's concerns daily. "Any new developments?" "Another piece of jewelry went missing last night. Look, I know you can't do much without concrete evidence, but I'm thinking of setting up some kind of test, something to flush out whoever's responsible." There was a pause on the other end. "Richard, be careful with entrapment scenarios. You don't want to create legal problems for yourself. What did you have in mind?" "Nothing illegal," Richard assured him, though his mind was already formulating a plan. "Just something to see how people react when opportunity presents itself." After ending the call, Richard walked to his wall safe, hidden behind a painting of sailing ships on a turbulent sea. He withdrew several $100 bills, each one carefully photographed, and the serial numbers recorded in a secure file on his computer. His plan was simple but effective. He would place the money in strategic locations around the house and monitor who discovered it and what they did next. That evening, as Margaret finished her duties and prepared to retire to her small room in the staff quarters above the garage, Richard began his elaborate setup. He placed $200 bills partially hidden under a crystal paperweight on the hallway console table, visible enough to be noticed by someone dusting, but not obviously planted. Another bill went into the library, tucked between the pages of a book on the coffee table that Margaret cleaned around each day. The final bill was positioned in his study beneath some loose papers on his desk, where Margaret emptied the wastebasket every morning. The next morning brought an unseasonably warm November day, with golden sunlight streaming through the mansion's tall windows. Margaret arrived at her usual time, noting that the family seemed to be watching her more intently than ever. Victoria lingered in the hallway as Margaret dusted the console table, pretending to arrange flowers while keeping one eye on the housekeeper's movements. Margaret worked methodically, lifting each object to clean beneath it. When she reached the crystal paperweight, she noticed the green paper beneath it immediately. Her heart stopped as she recognized the $100 bill. For a moment, she stood frozen, the weight of the discovery crushing down on her. This could be a test, a trap designed to catch the thief, or it could be money that Mr. Whitmore had simply forgotten. Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully lifted the paperweight, removed the bill and examined it. The serial number seemed to mock her, though she didn't know it had been recorded. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. If she kept the money and it was indeed a test, she would be branded a thief and lose her job, and with it, her ability to support her family. If she left it there, it might disappear anyway, and she could still be blamed. If she turned it in and it wasn't a test, she might appear foolish or presumptuous. Victoria watched from the corner of her eye, her manicured fingers tightening around the flower stems. She had been skeptical of her husband's plan, but now she found herself holding her breath, waiting to see what Margaret would do. Margaret made her decision with the quiet dignity that had carried her through years of adversity. She walked directly to Richard's study, where he sat behind his desk, pretending to review financial documents while actually watching security camera feeds on his laptop. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said softly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I found this while cleaning." She placed the $100 bill on his desk with the careful reverence one might show a piece of evidence. Richard looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "Found it where?" "Under the crystal paperweight in the hallway, sir. I thought you should know in case it fell from somewhere important." He studied her face intently, searching for any sign of deception or calculation. Instead, he saw only the same quiet integrity that had characterized her work for 3 years. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll look into where it came from." As Margaret left the study, Richard felt a mixture of relief and shame. Relief that his longtime housekeeper had passed his test, and shame that he had felt the need to test her at all. But his experiment was far from over. There were still 2 more bills planted around the house. The afternoon brought similar results. Margaret discovered the money in the library and immediately brought it to Richard's attention. By evening, when she found the 3rd bill while emptying his wastebasket, Richard was beginning to understand that he had gravely misjudged his faithful employee. But the real revelation was yet to come. As Margaret prepared to leave that evening, she approached Richard one final time. "Mr. Whitmore, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but if money is being left around the house accidentally, you might want to be more careful. With all the concern about theft recently, finding cash lying around could put any of us in a difficult position." Her words hung in the air like an indictment of his scheme. Richard realized that Margaret had likely understood exactly what was happening, but had chosen to respond with integrity rather than accusation. The trap he had set had indeed caught something, but not a thief. Instead, it had revealed the true character of a woman he had been too quick to suspect. The weekend arrived with an unexpected warmth that seemed to mock the chill that had settled over the Whitmore household. Richard found himself unable to concentrate on his usual Saturday routine of reviewing market reports and playing tennis at the country club. Margaret's quiet dignity in returning his planted money had stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a mixture of guilt and growing realization that he had been pursuing the wrong suspect entirely. He stood in his study that Saturday morning, staring out at the sprawling lawn where James was raking the last stubborn leaves of autumn. The security cameras he had installed throughout the house blinked their red recording lights like accusatory eyes, and Richard found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the people who worked in his home. Victoria entered the room, carrying her morning coffee, her silk robe rustling against the hardwood floor. Even on weekends, she maintained an air of polished elegance that had first attracted him 20 years ago. "You've been distracted all week," she observed, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "The Margaret situation." "She returned every bill," Richard said quietly, not turning from the window. "Every single one. Found them, brought them directly to me, never hesitated." "Well, that's good, isn't it?" Victoria's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Though I suppose it doesn't necessarily prove anything. She might have known it was a test." Richard finally turned to face his wife, noting how she avoided his direct gaze. "Victoria, when exactly did your pearl necklace go missing?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "I told you, Wednesday night. I noticed it was gone Thursday morning when I was getting dressed for the charity luncheon." "And where did you last remember seeing it?" Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "On my dressing table in the jewelry box, where I always keep it." Her answers came too quickly, too rehearsed, and Richard felt a cold recognition settling in his stomach. "Show me," he said simply. They walked together to Victoria's dressing room, a space that resembled a high-end boutique more than a bedroom closet. Rows of designer clothing hung in perfect order, while an entire wall was dedicated to shoes, arranged by color and season. The jewelry collection occupied a custom-built cabinet with multiple drawers and compartments. "Here," Victoria said, pointing to an empty spot in the velvet-lined drawer. "Right here is where I always keep the pearls." Richard studied the empty space, then opened the drawer completely. His trained eye, sharpened by years of forensic financial analysis, immediately noticed something Victoria had missed. "Victoria, look at the dust patterns." "What do you mean?" "The dust, Victoria. Look at how it settled around the other jewelry." He pointed to the faint outlines that showed where various pieces typically rested. "There's no outline for the pearls, no indication they were ever kept in this exact spot." Victoria's face paled, but she maintained her composure. I might have moved them around. You know how I reorganize things." But Richard was already moving, his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. He began opening other drawers, other compartments, looking for patterns that didn't match Victoria's story. In the bottom drawer, beneath a tangle of costume jewelry she rarely wore, he found what he was looking for. The missing items were there, not all of them, but enough. Victoria's diamond earrings, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, a small stack of bills, some of which he recognized from his own desk. And there, coiled like an accusation, were the missing pearls. "Victoria." His voice was deadly quiet. "What is this?" She stared at the evidence of her deception, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like a house of cards. "Richard, I can explain. You've been taking things, your own things, money from the house, and letting the staff, letting Margaret, fall under suspicion." The betrayal cut deeper than he had expected. "Why?" Victoria sank onto the velvet bench in front of her mirror, her reflection showing a woman he barely recognized. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The charity boards, the social expectations. Everyone assumes we have unlimited resources, but you've been so focused on the market volatility, cutting back on expenses. So you decided to steal from our own house and frame the help?" "I wasn't framing anyone." Victoria's voice rose in desperation. I needed some cash that you wouldn't track, for personal expenses. The jewelry. I was planning to have replicas made, then return the originals. No one would have known. Except you let suspicion fall on innocent people, on Margaret, who has been nothing but loyal to this family for 3 years. Richard felt anger building in his chest, not just at the theft, but at the casual cruelty of allowing others to suffer for her actions. "It's not like she would have gone to jail or anything," Victoria said weakly. "Worst case, she would have been let go with a reference. A reference for what? Suspected theft. Do you have any idea how that would affect her ability to find other work? Her family depends on her income, Victoria. Her mother's medical bills, her daughter's education. How do you know all that?" Victoria asked, genuine surprise in her voice. Richard realized that despite living in the same house for 3 years, his wife knew almost nothing about the woman who had cleaned their home, prepared their meals, and maintained their comfortable lifestyle. "Because I pay attention. Because I ask questions, because I treat the people who work for us like human beings." The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock on Victoria's dresser. Richard stared at his wife, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The revelation went beyond the theft. It exposed a fundamental disconnect between them, a difference in values that he wasn't sure could be bridged. "What happens now?" Victoria asked quietly. Richard collected the stolen items from the drawer, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Now I make this right. I owe Margaret an apology, a significant one. And you, we'll figure out what this means for us later." As he left the dressing room, carrying the evidence of his wife's betrayal, Richard felt the weight of his own mistakes. He had been so quick to suspect the help, so ready to believe that poverty bred dishonesty, that he had missed the corruption in his own home. The trap he had set had indeed caught a thief, just not the one he had expected. The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore estate as Richard stood in his study, holding the recovered stolen items like evidence of his own moral failure. He hadn't slept well, his mind churning with the implications of Victoria's betrayal and his own readiness to suspect an innocent woman. The house felt different now, the familiar luxury tainted by the knowledge of what had transpired within its walls. Margaret arrived for work at her usual time, unaware that her world was about to change dramatically. She went through her morning routine with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her 3 years of service, preparing coffee and organizing the day's tasks. Richard watched her from the kitchen doorway, noting details he had previously overlooked: the careful way she handled the family's belongings, the respect she showed for their space even when she thought no one was watching. "Margaret," he called softly, startling her slightly. "Could I speak with you in the living room, please?" Her face showed a flicker of concern. In her experience, formal conversations rarely brought good news for people in her position. She followed him into the elegant living room where, just days earlier, he had addressed the staff about the thefts. This time, however, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Richard gestured for her to sit on the sofa, a gesture that surprised her. Usually, staff meetings were conducted with her standing respectfully while he remained seated. Instead, he took the chair across from her, placing them on more equal footing. "Margaret, I owe you a profound apology," he began, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "The thefts in our home, I know who was responsible, and it wasn't you or any of the other staff members." Margaret's eyes widened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "It was Victoria." The words felt strange leaving his lips, but he pressed on. "She was taking items from the house, including her own jewelry, to sell for personal expenses. She allowed all of you to fall under suspicion when she could have spoken up at any time." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had spent sleepless nights worrying about her job security, wondering if her years of honest service would be enough to protect her from false accusations. To learn that the true culprit was the very person she had worked so hard to please left her speechless. "The money I placed around the house," Richard continued, shame coloring his voice. "That was a test. I was trying to catch a thief, but I was looking in entirely the wrong direction. You found every single bill and brought it directly to me without hesitation. Your integrity in the face of my suspicion has shown me exactly the kind of person you are, and exactly the kind of person I failed to be." Margaret finally found her voice. "Mrs. Whitmore, is she?" "She's upstairs packing some things. We have a lot to work through, and I think some time apart might be necessary." Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But that's not why I wanted to speak with you. Your job here is secure, more than secure. I want to offer you a significant raise, and I want to make sure you know how much this family values what you do. Mr. Whitmore, Margaret's voice caught with emotion. "I just want to work honestly, that's all I've ever wanted." "I know that now, and I should have known it from the beginning." Richard stood and walked to his desk, returning with an envelope. "This contains a formal letter of recommendation that acknowledges your 3 years of exemplary service, your trustworthiness, and your dedication. Whether you choose to stay with us or find employment elsewhere, you'll never have to worry about references again." Margaret accepted the envelope with trembling hands. In her world, a good reference was worth more than gold. It was the foundation upon which her entire future could be built. "There's something else," Richard continued. "I've been thinking about your situation, your mother's medical expenses, your daughter's education costs. I'd like to help." "Sir, I couldn't accept charity." "It's not charity," Richard interrupted gently. "It's an investment. I'm offering you a partnership in a small cleaning service business. You would manage it, hire other reliable people like yourself, and serve clients who appreciate quality and trustworthiness. The initial capital would come from me, but the business would be yours to build." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why would you?" "Because I've learned something important about character this week. I've spent my career analyzing businesses, evaluating investments based on the integrity of their leadership, yet I failed to recognize the most trustworthy person in my own home." Richard's voice grew stronger with conviction. "You've proven that honesty isn't determined by wealth or social status. It's a choice that people make every day, regardless of their circumstances." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it. You've been taking care of other people's homes for 15 years. Maybe it's time you had the opportunity to build something of your own." As they talked through the details of his proposal, Richard felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. His business success had always been measured in dollars and market share, but this felt different, more meaningful. He was investing in a person rather than a commodity, and the potential returns couldn't be calculated on any spreadsheet. Emma appeared in the doorway, having returned from her morning run. Her cheeks were flushed from exercise, but her expression was serious. "Dad? I heard what happened with Mom." "Emma, we should discuss this privately." "No, it's okay," she interrupted, looking directly at Margaret. "I wanted to apologize too. I should have spoken up more about how hard you work, how much you care about our family. Maybe if I had, this wouldn't have happened." Margaret stood and placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "You have nothing to apologize for, miss. You've always treated me with kindness." As the morning progressed, word of the truth spread through the household staff. James, Mrs. Henderson, Carlos, and even Diane expressed their relief and support for Margaret. The atmosphere in the house began to shift, moving from suspicion and tension towards something resembling a genuine community. By afternoon, Margaret had made her decision. She would accept Richard's business proposal, not just for herself, but for all the other hard-working people who deserved opportunities to build better lives. As she prepared to leave that evening, she carried with her not just a job, but hope for a future she had never dared to imagine. The millionaire's trap had indeed revealed the truth, just not the truth he had expected to find.